The Scramble for Africa, How Europe Stole an Entire Continent. Part 2 of the 10-part Africa series, The Colonization of Africa. The Silent Invasion of Africa. In 1884, European leaders gathered in Berlin to discuss Africa. No African kings, no tribal leaders, no local representatives were present. The fate of an entire continent was decided without the people who lived there. This event, known as the Berlin Conference, marked the beginning of the greatest land grab in human history. In just a few decades, nearly 90% of Africa was carved up and controlled by European empires. This was called the Scramble for Africa, but in reality, it was a systematic invasion, colonization, and looting of an entire continent. So how did Africa, home to powerful kingdoms, trade networks, and civilizations, fall under European rule so quickly? How did European powers justify this invasion? And most importantly, what did Africa lose? This episode uncovers how Europe stole an entire continent and the devastating consequences that followed. The Berlin Conference, How Europe Decided Africa's Fate Without Africans. By the late 19th century, Europe's industrial revolution was at its peak, and with it came an insatiable hunger for raw materials, labor, and new markets to fuel economic growth. The continent of Africa, rich in gold, diamonds, rubber, fertile land, and labor, was seen as the perfect opportunity to satisfy Europe's growing demands. However, Africa was not an unclaimed land. It was home to millions of people, powerful empires, thriving trade networks, and ancient cultures that had existed for thousands of years. But for European colonizers, Africa was a prize to be conquered, regardless of who lived there. At this time, European explorers, missionaries, and traders were expanding their presence in Africa, often clashing with rival colonial powers. Nations like Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and Portugal all wanted control over African territories. This led to diplomatic tensions and the risk of war among European nations. To prevent a European war over African resources, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck organized a conference in Berlin from November 1884 to February 1885. The conference was meant to divide Africa among European nations in a way that avoided conflict between them, but the Africans themselves were completely excluded from the discussions. The Berlin Conference, a meeting to divide an entire continent. At the Berlin Conference, 14 European nations, including Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, gathered to carve up Africa as if it were an unclaimed, ownerless land. Despite the fact that Africa had thousands of independent kingdoms, tribal communities, and empires, the sovereignty of African nations was completely ignored. No African rulers were invited. African kings and leaders had no say in the decisions that would affect their land, resources, and people. No African voices were heard. The entire conference focused on European territorial ambitions, with no regard for African cultures, governance, or historical territories. Decisions were made entirely by Europeans, who saw Africa as a commodity to be exploited, not as a land of people with their own civilizations. The Berlin Conference was not about bringing peace. It was about organizing theft on a grand scale. The goal was to prevent European nations from fighting each other over African lands, while ensuring that Africans themselves had no power to resist colonization. The Berlin Conference set the stage for the brutal European colonization of Africa. By the time the conference ended, nearly 90% of the African continent was placed under European control. European powers imposed artificial borders, ignoring existing ethnic, linguistic, and cultural divisions, which would later fuel conflicts and civil wars that continue to this day. Britain took control of Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and Nigeria. Their main goal was to build the Cape to Cairo Railway, a massive infrastructure project designed to connect British-controlled territories from the northern tip of Africa to the south. This project had nothing to do with African development. It was meant to secure British dominance over the continent and control key trade routes. France seized Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and large parts of West Africa, including Senegal, Mali, Ivory Coast, and Chad. The French forced millions of Africans into slave labor to build roads, railways, and plantations. Africans were not considered citizens under French rule. They were treated as forced laborers under a brutal colonial system. Belgium took Congo, which became one of the most brutal colonies in history under King Leopold II. The Congo was run as Leopold's personal business empire, where Africans were forced to harvest rubber under horrific conditions. Millions of Congolese were killed, mutilated, or starved while the Belgian economy flourished on profits made from African resources. Germany claimed Namibia, Tanzania, and Cameroon. German forces used genocidal tactics to suppress African uprisings, wiping out entire communities. In Namibia, the Herero and Nama people were nearly exterminated in one of the first genocides of the 20th century. Portugal took Mozambique and Angola, using forced labor to extract minerals, timber, and cash crops for European consumption. Africans were treated as slaves in their own land, with brutal working conditions and severe punishments. Africa's borders were drawn in European boardrooms, not by the people who lived there. The Berlin Conference set Africa on a path of destruction, suffering, and exploitation that lasted for more than a century. The legacy of colonization still affects African nations today. African communities that had coexisted for centuries were suddenly split into different colonies controlled by different European powers. Meanwhile, rival ethnic groups were forced into the same territories, creating deep tensions that later led to civil wars and ethnic violence. Once powerful kingdoms and empires such as the Ashanti Empire, the Kingdom of Congo, and the Zulu Kingdom were dismantled and their leaders either executed or exiled. African rulers lost control over their own lands, and their people were subjected to colonial rule, taxation, and forced labor. Before European colonization, Africa had thriving trade routes connecting it to Asia and the Middle East, including the trans-Saharan gold trade and the Indian Ocean trade networks. The European colonial economy destroyed these networks, replacing them with a system where Africa only produced raw materials for European industries. African men were forced to work in European plantations, mines, and construction projects. Women and children were left to fend for themselves in villages, while many were enslaved and sold into labor camps. Africans were taxed heavily by colonial authorities, forcing them to work just to survive. European colonizers outlawed African languages, religions, and traditions, imposing Christianity and European customs instead. Traditional African governance systems were dismantled, and European-style laws were introduced, often favoring European settlers over native populations. Indigenous education systems were erased, and Western-style schools promoted colonial propaganda to make Africans accept their oppression. The Berlin Conference was not about diplomacy or African development. It was about the systematic plundering of Africa. By the end of the conference, Africa was no longer in the hands of its own people. It was divided into European possessions, where Africans became second-class citizens in their own lands. This was not just colonization, it was a violent takeover, an economic heist, and a humanitarian disaster. The justifications: how Europe lied to the world to defend colonization. By the 19th century, European powers had mastered the art of deception when it came to justifying their brutal expansion across Africa. Colonization was not about development, progress, or civilization. It was about theft, exploitation, and control. However, to make their conquests appear moral and acceptable to the European public, colonial governments, scholars, and newspapers manufactured a series of lies to justify their actions. These false justifications were widely spread through government policies, school textbooks, religious institutions, and propaganda, creating a false narrative that painted Europe as the hero and Africa as a land in need of salvation. Each of these justifications served a clear purpose: to convince the world that Africa needed European rule while hiding the true horrors of colonization. Civilizing Mission, lie. The myth that Europe brought progress. One of the most commonly used excuses for colonization was the civilizing mission, the belief that Europeans were bringing education, Christianity, and modern governance to Africa. European leaders portrayed themselves as benevolent rulers who were saving Africans from barbarism, ignorance, and underdevelopment. How this lie was spread: government officials claimed that African societies were backward and needed European rule. Christian missionaries were sent to convert Africans, but they also acted as agents of colonialism, helping European powers expand their control. School textbooks and newspapers described Africa as a land of tribes and savages with no history or civilization before European contact. However, this was a complete distortion of reality. Africa was not an uncivilized land. It was home to some of the most advanced civilizations in history. The Mali Empire, 14th century, was one of the richest empires in the world. It was ruled by Mansa Musa, the richest man in history, who controlled vast trade routes, gold mines, and one of the largest economies of his time. Timbuktu was one of the greatest centers of learning in the world. The Sankore University had thousands of scholars studying mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law centuries before European universities caught up. Many African societies had well-developed governance systems. The Kingdom of Congo had a structured political system, diplomatic relations with Europe, and a centralized monarchy. Ethiopia maintained an independent empire with one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world, long before European missionaries arrived. The Ashanti Empire, the Benin Kingdom, and the Swahili Coast city-states had complex economies, extensive trade networks, and powerful military forces. The truth was that European colonizers were not interested in civilization. They were interested in resources. Their real goal was to loot Africa's wealth while enslaving its people. Colonization did not bring civilization to Africa. It destroyed civilizations that had existed for centuries. The Africa is empty myth, how Europeans pretended they were discovering Africa. Another major lie used to justify colonization was the claim that Africa was an uninhabited wilderness, free for the taking. European explorers deliberately ignored African cities, cultures, and populations, presenting Africa as a dark, unknown land that needed European exploration. How this lie was spread. British explorer Cecil Rhodes famously said, "We must find new lands from which we can easily obtain raw materials, and the native inhabitants should be used as cheap labor." European maps of Africa deliberately ignored indigenous cities, trade routes, and empires. European textbooks taught that Africa was discovered by European explorers, completely erasing the existence of African civilizations before European arrival. Many African lands were declared terra nullius, nobody's land, a legal term used by colonizers to justify taking over regions where they claimed there were no organized governments. In reality, Africa was home to over 10,000 independent nations, tribes, and civilizations, each with its own governance, economy, and traditions. The Kingdom of Congo had diplomatic ties with Portugal as early as the 15th century, long before the Berlin Conference. The Zulu Kingdom in southern Africa was one of the most powerful states in Africa, with an organized military and well-established leadership. The Great Zimbabwe civilization built massive stone structures and ruled over a powerful trading empire. The Hausa city-states of Nigeria had well-developed markets and trade systems. The discovery of Africa was a myth. The land was already home to millions of people, thriving societies, and organized civilizations. European explorers did not discover Africa, they invaded it. The Africans are primitive propaganda, how Europe used racism to justify colonization. One of the most dangerous and lasting justifications for colonization was the racist belief that Africans were inferior, uncivilized, and incapable of governing themselves. European powers used racism as a political tool to justify their brutal rule and economic exploitation. How this lie was spread, pseudoscientific racism. European scientists claimed that Africans were biologically inferior to Europeans. These racist ideas were published in medical journals and used to support colonial rule. Anthropologists staged racist human zoos in Europe, displaying African men, women, and children in cages as if they were animals. African spirituality, traditions, and governance systems were mocked and outlawed. European powers replaced them with Western-style laws, forced Christianity, and European customs. African languages were suppressed, and native names were replaced with European ones. This propaganda was not just about controlling Africa. It was about controlling the minds of Europeans so they would support colonization. Europeans were taught that Africans were savages who needed European rule, so they would not question the brutality of colonization. By portraying Africans as inferior, colonizers justified forced labor, brutal punishments, and massacres, claiming they were for the greater good. European countries used racism to keep African nations politically and economically dependent, even after independence. The real reason for colonization was not to civilize Africa. It was to enslave its people, extract its wealth, and turn it into a resource colony for Europe. The reality, colonization was not about civilization, it was about looting. Every justification for colonization was a lie. Africa was not uncivilized. Europeans destroyed civilizations that had flourished for centuries. Africa was not empty. Millions of people lived there long before European invasion. Africans were not primitive. Europeans used racist lies to justify economic exploitation and mass murder. Colonization did not develop Africa, it robbed it. The brutality of colonization, how Africa was stolen by force. European colonization of Africa was not a peaceful process. It was a violent invasion that resulted in the deaths of millions of Africans, the destruction of entire civilizations, and the mass looting of natural resources. Despite European claims of bringing civilization to Africa, the reality was that colonial rule was built on enslavement, forced labor, torture, and genocide. Each European power imposed brutal policies on the territories they conquered, leading to suffering on an unimaginable scale. The Congo Free State, Belgium's Reign of Terror, 1885 to 1908. One of the most horrifying examples of colonial brutality took place in the Congo Free State, which was controlled personally by King Leopold II of Belgium from 1885 to 1908. Leopold II treated Congo as his private property, exploiting its people and resources for personal profit. Millions of Congolese were subjected to forced labor, torture, and execution under Leopold's rule. Those who failed to meet rubber production quotas had their hands or feet cut off as punishment. In the late 19th century, rubber became one of the most valuable commodities in the world due to the rise of bicycles and automobiles. Congo had vast rainforests filled with rubber trees, making it a prime target for exploitation. Leopold's administration forced entire villages to collect rubber under brutal conditions. Villagers who failed to meet their quotas were executed, mutilated, or had their families taken as hostages. The Force Publique, Leopold's private army, carried out massacres to instill fear. Between 5 to 10 million Congolese people died as a result of executions, disease, starvation, and exhaustion due to forced labor. One of the most notorious practices was the cutting off of hands and feet. Soldiers were required to provide proof that they had killed rebels or workers who refused to harvest rubber. To prove this, they severed hands from the dead, or sometimes even from the living, and presented them to their superiors. Entire families were slaughtered, and villages were burned to the ground if they resisted Belgian rule. Leopold II's reign in Congo was one of the worst genocides in history, yet it was covered up by European powers for decades. By 1908, international outrage forced Belgium to take over the Congo from Leopold II, but the exploitation and oppression continued until Congo's independence in 1960. The British invasion of southern Africa, war, land theft, and concentration camps. Britain's colonization of southern Africa led to a series of brutal conflicts, mass displacement, and economic exploitation. The British fought against the Zulu Kingdom, Boers, and indigenous African groups to establish dominance. African land was confiscated and given to white settlers, forcing local populations into poverty and forced labor. Thousands of Africans were placed in concentration camps where disease, starvation, and forced labor led to mass deaths. The Zulu resistance in the Anglo-Zulu War, 1879. The Zulu Kingdom, led by King Cetshwayo, was one of the last African forces to resist British expansion in southern Africa. In 1879, the Anglo-Zulu War broke out, where the British used superior weaponry to overpower the Zulu army. After initial victories by the Zulu at Isandlwana, the British retaliated with extreme force, burning Zulu villages, seizing land, and ultimately annexing the kingdom. The Boer Wars, British concentration camps, 1899 to 1902. In the late 19th century, gold and diamonds were discovered in South Africa, leading to a struggle between British imperialists and Dutch-descended Boers, Afrikaners. The Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, led to Britain setting up concentration camps where thousands of civilians, Africans and Boers alike, were starved, tortured, and forced into labor. Over 20,000 black South Africans died in these camps due to malnutrition and disease. British control over southern Africa ensured that gold and diamond mines, such as those owned by Cecil Rhodes de Beers Company, were entirely in European hands. France controlled large portions of West and Central Africa, including Algeria, Senegal, Mali, Guinea, and the Ivory Coast. Entire African communities were enslaved to work on French plantations. Traditional rulers were stripped of power, and African cultures were suppressed. Africans were forced to fight in European wars, such as World War I and World War II, with no rights or recognition. The French government forced Africans to work in plantations, mines, and infrastructure projects. Africans had to pay heavy colonial taxes, while most of the wealth from agriculture, minerals, and labor flowed to France. Thousands of Africans were forcibly conscripted into the French army and sent to fight in both World War I and World War II. Many African soldiers who fought for France were denied rights and pensions after the war. Germany controlled Namibia, then called German Southwest Africa, in the early 20th century and carried out one of the first genocides of the modern era. The Herero and Nama genocide, 1904 to 1908, saw the German army massacre 80% of the Herero people. Survivors were put in concentration camps, used as forced labor, and starved to death. When the Herero and Nama peoples resisted German rule, the German government responded with extermination orders. German troops surrounded Herero people in the desert and poisoned their water sources, leading to mass death from thirst. Those who survived were executed or placed in concentration camps, where they were forced into hard labor and subjected to medical experiments. Tens of thousands of Africans were wiped out in what is now recognized as one of the earliest genocides of the 20th century. The impact. What Africa lost due to colonization. Loss of sovereignty. Once powerful African kingdoms were dismantled, and rulers were either executed or exiled. Stolen wealth. Africa's gold, diamonds, oil, and natural resources were looted, enriching European nations while Africa was left in poverty. Destroyed cultures. African languages, traditions, and identities were erased, replaced by European systems, Christian missionary education, and colonial propaganda. Divided nations. Artificial colonial borders forced rival ethnic groups into the same countries, leading to civil wars, political instability, and ongoing conflicts that persist today. Millions of deaths. African resistance was met with massacres, forced labor, and starvation. Even after official decolonization in the 20th century, Africa continues to suffer from the economic, social, and political destruction left by colonial rule. Europe did not bring civilization to Africa. They brought genocide, mass exploitation, and destruction. The colonization of Africa was not about progress, development, or civilization. It was about theft, control, and the destruction of African societies. European powers did not come to help Africa, they came to exploit it. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 set the stage for one of the largest land grabs in history, dividing Africa among European nations without any regard for the people who lived there. To justify their brutal rule, European powers fabricated a series of lies. The Civilizing Mission myth. Europeans claimed they were bringing civilization, education, and modern governance to Africa. In reality, Africa already had advanced civilizations, powerful kingdoms, thriving trade networks, and centers of learning like Timbuktu long before European colonization. The Africa is empty myth. European explorers falsely portrayed Africa as a vast, uninhabited wilderness waiting to be discovered, deliberately erasing the existence of thousands of independent African nations and empires. The Africans are primitive propaganda. European colonizers spread racist theories to justify oppression, forced labor, and the destruction of African traditions. They banned African languages, imposed European legal systems, and suppressed native religions and governance structures. But the truth is clear. Africa was never a land of savages. It was a continent of innovation, trade, and governance. Colonization did not bring progress. It brought war, slavery, and economic destruction. Europe did not civilize Africa. It looted Africa. These lies were not just used to justify invasion. They were used to maintain control, ensuring Africa remained under European dominance for generations. The effects of these justifications are still felt today, in economic dependency, racial stereotypes, and continued foreign influence in African politics. In the next part, we will expose the darkest reality of colonization, the looting of Africa's resources and wealth. Stay tuned. History must not be forgotten. If you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe. Hit the bell icon to uncover more hidden truths of history.